From the American Society for Microbiology, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 501, recorded on June 25th, 2018. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you are listening to the podcast all about viruses. I am so excited to bring you this episode today. We are recording in the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, and we are sitting in an exhibit called Outbreak, Epidemics in a Connected World. I feel like I'm a kid in a candy shop because these around me are all the viruses that I think of and talk about on a daily basis. And today I have with me three individuals who have played different roles in this exhibit. And on my right, from the Smithsonian Institution, she is a curator of biological anthropology, Sabrina Sholts. Welcome to TWiV.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Next to her, from the Eco Health Alliance, where he is a vice president for science and outreach, Jon Epstein. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And all the way in the end, some of you may remember from the University of Buffalo, he's an emeritus professor of microbiology, Ed Niles. Welcome back.
Hi, Vincent. Happy to be here.
And we're going to talk a little bit about the roles of these individuals in this exhibit, the exhibit itself, and so forth. And I want to start by asking a little bit of all of you of your background. Sabrina, in particular, how does one become a curator of a museum?
Well, it's a good question. We are all scientists at this museum, so we all have PhDs, and our research interests fall into one of 7 scientific departments that we have here at this museum. The path, I would say, to get to a curator position here is similar to one that might lead to being a university professor. But you know, and our jobs are similar, but I'll say that the difference between a professor and a curator is that we don't have a requirement to teach, and we build and study collections that we keep here at the museum.
But you are teaching the public, of course.
We are, indeed, yeah. So, I mean, we don't give degrees,
right.
I'll say that,
right.
But we have a lot of other training and education involved.
So how far back can you remember wanting to be a curator?
You know, I don't think it was something that I even considered as a likelihood for me. I wasn't going down some track for museum studies. You know, quite honestly, I was very fortunate that the position here opened up with, you know, description that was very similar to the kind of research I do and interest that I have at a time when I was very interested in doing something like this. So
coincidence, luck, you know, serendipity,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So what is your PhD in?
Anthropology. Yeah.
Okay. Where did you do that? What
University of Santa Barbara, or University of California, Santa Barbara.
Lovely
yeah.
place.
It was really nice.
and in that field, do you also do postdoctoral training?
Yeah, so I did a postdoc at Berkeley at the Human Evolution Research Center in the Department of Integrated Biology. And then I did a second postdoc at Stockholm University in the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics.
Right. Yeah. And how long have you been at the museum now?
A little over 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you originally from California?
No, I'm from Minnesota.
Wow. That's the second Minnesotan scientist we've had on TWiV.
Really?
I just interviewed someone at ASM in Atlanta, and Stacy Horner. She's also from Minnesota.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's a disproportionate number of Minnesotans in science.
I find Minnesotans everywhere. We run into each other.
Right.
We recognize the accent.
Now, Jon, you're at the Eco Health Alliance. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from originally.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. My background is as a veterinarian, originally a wildlife veterinarian, but I did my PhD in disease ecology. So my interest has been really understanding the connections between animal health and human health and the viruses that circulate in wildlife that make their way into people.
Are you a veterinarian as well as a PhD?
I'm not a practicing veterinarian right now, so I'm squarely in research.
Okay.
But yes, yeah, I went to vet school up at Tufts in Massachusetts before I made my way down to New York to work for Eco Health Alliance.
We're heading up there to the Tufts Vet School in the fall to do TWiV. There's a group that looks at influenza in seals.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
They catch seals and they swab them and put them back. You must know about that. Right?
There's one of the reasons I went to Tufts was that it has a really good wildlife department in a wildlife hospital. It's one of the few vet schools that does. It was really interesting for me. I mean, my path has been really windy and strange to get here. This is, was not something that was in the plans early on in terms of public health. But
I always tell people that you don't have to plan it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Science career can just happen.
It just does.
Yeah.
Did you do a postdoc as well?
No, I didn't do a postdoc. I worked, so after vet school, I came to New York to work at EcoHealth Alliance, actually. So I've been there for about 15 years. And in the process of doing the research I've been doing at EcoHealth Alliance, I did my PhD, and it was on Nipah virus, which I'm sure we'll talk about as one of the viruses covered by this exhibit. But so I kind of did that along the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
So EcoHealth Alliance is right in Manhattan, right?
It is. It's right in Manhattan. We're a nonprofit organization that's focused on really stopping or ending pandemics by understanding the ecology of diseases, why they emerge, how they operate in nature, how they end up making their way into human populations, and really working to be able to predict that and stop them from happening.
So do you do some research there, or do you mainly support other people doing research?
Oh no, I have a lot of research that I do there as well. All of our research is overseas internationally. So we work with partners on the ground in about 25 different countries, studying different viral pathogens. We tend to focus on viruses because they're just so important in terms of emerging diseases and epidemics that are happening more recently. So my research has been about Nipah virus. I've looked at Ebola. A lot of it's centered on bat-borne viral pathogens. It also was unexpected, but so that's my research focus on. But I also support and direct programs that are going on there as well.
There's some cool bats in this exhibit, right? Hanging from the ceiling.
I think one of the things that was exciting for me about doing something here at the museum was being able to use the collections, right, and have actual bats that are actually involved in some of these
bats
diseases.
Are from the collection of the museum, right?
There are ones from the collections over back in our research section of the exhibit, and then near the front we've got models. Of bats hanging from the ceiling, and then we do have another bat over in our Nipah section.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very cool
display,
here.
Yeah.
So you have to come see it, listeners. Come, because it's just awesome. I learned from Robert Costello yesterday that you have 175 million objects in your collection here. And quite a few of them are here. There are lots of mosquitoes in this collection, ticks.
Absolutely.
A few other animals. It's really remarkable. Ed, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a biochemist. I was an undergraduate at the University of Buffalo. And as an undergraduate, I started off thinking I was going to go to med school, but I found I liked chemistry too much, and I decided graduate school was right for me. I went to the University of Massachusetts, where I was trained as an enzymologist, learned basic biochemistry. It seems like such a long time ago. And then off to Yale as a postdoc, where I studied a bacteriophage, T7. That's where I met Rich Condit, and he and I worked together, I guess, throughout our careers, off and on, various times. But we studied an enzyme, T7 RNA polymerase, and the work I do with Rich had to do with mapping the transcripts that were made in vitro. We did a really nice set of experiments that I think back very fondly on to map these transcripts. And then off to Buffalo to be an assistant professor in the biochemistry department. I started off looking at transcription in protozoan Tetrahymena piriformis, and then switched back to viruses, and spent much of my career studying Vaccinia virus, where my laboratory looked at gene structure and the mechanisms of gene expression in Vaccinia. I also did a really productive collaboration with a friend named Phil Laverty on schistosome signaling, the disease being schistosomiasis, it's a parasite. And then decided that the point came when I decided that it was time to leave the lab. So I closed my lab and left the university and came here, where I took a job at a component of the Department of Health and Human Services named BARDA. I served as an interdisciplinary scientist involved in projects that were focused on late-stage development of vaccines and antivirals, antibiotics directed against Class A agents. And that also came to an end, and now my wife and I live happily in Alexandria, Virginia.
In fact, when we had you on TWiV last, it was TWiV 120, a long time ago, we recorded it in your living room of your home in Alexandria.
That's correct, yeah.
And this is the great, listen to this, we're recording, and he has a mail slot in his door. Mailman comes, puts mail in, boom, this big noise in the middle of the recording. It's the Journal of Biological Chemistry, big fat journal being delivered in the middle of the, perfect, right?
Perfect, yeah.
Episode.
Wow.
In that time you were working at BARDA, and since then you've stopped doing BARDA work. And
I was focused primarily on the development of antivirals and vaccines, improved vaccines for smallpox.
Right.
With my vaccine background, that made the most sense. And, you know, it was time when my job was done, and it was time to turn that job over to someone who was better suited to what needed to be done subsequent to my time. So I was happy to do that.
And I heard before that you've been a guide at this museum for 5 years.
That's correct. I started, well, it turns out that soon after we arrived here 10 years ago, my wife became associated with the museum, and she's here every Wednesday morning at the information desk down on the Constitution Avenue side. So there's this delightful little woman who sits at the desk, and so you can go speak with her. She's nice. And so she kept me informed about what was going on at the museum. And when I was working at BARDA, I didn't have time to do this. But as soon as I left government service, I had time on my hands, and I decided I'd like to become involved. And it coincided very nicely with the appearance of the Human Genome exhibit. And so that was right up my alley, and I was happy to become a part of that.
Okay, and then we'll talk a bit later, but you've been a guide in this Outbreak exhibit.
Since the beginning, yes. Which was only a month ago. But
right. Yeah. Now, Jon, what has been your role in this exhibit?
I came in at the beginning as well. This exhibit was really the brainchild of infectious disease physician Daniel Lucy, and he and I have known each other professionally, and he invited me to join as a consultant, and so I've really served as the chief scientific consultant on this exhibit, and for about the past year and a half, I've really helped to principally develop content with Sabrina and the exhibit team. Some of the work in here is stuff I've had direct involvement with. Others is just, helping develop visuals or input, and so.
Yeah, we'll explore some in some detail. And Sabrina, what has been your role?
So I am a curator in this museum, right, in anthropology, but I'm also the curator of the exhibit. And so how we do our exhibits here, there's always a curator who's there to represent the science, who's responsible for the fidelity of the information and making sure that everything is correct, that it's appropriate, that we're addressing everything we should, we're not missing anything that we shouldn't, and really to work with the exhibit developers, the educators, with our ideas and sort of our knowledge of the science to come up with the stories that we're going to show.
So if there's a misspelled word, it's your fault, right?
Yes. The buck stops here. I missed it, but good luck. Yeah, please tell me.
Okay. So Jon had mentioned the origins of this in an infectious disease physician. Maybe you could fill us in. How did this get started?
Right. Well, so Jon did say yes. This exhibit was the idea of Daniel Lucy, who has been going to outbreaks, I believe, since SARS in 2003. And it was from West Africa in 2014 when he was treating Ebola patients that he submitted a proposal for an idea for an exhibit, which we invite anyone in the public to do. Just things that they might want to see in our museum, in their museum. We're a public museum. And Dan, I think, understood that the public should know more about the effects of outbreaks and epidemics, infectious diseases, and how and why they emerge. And so, he submitted this and thought it'd be great to have here. I think the best, platform to deliver this information to the public on such a large scale. And we agreed. So, once we,
I was just going to add, it was particularly impressive that Dan really also not only understood the epidemics he wanted to talk about in this exhibit, but he got the relationship with humans, animals, the environment, which, we'll talk about the One Health concept and what this is really built around, but there aren't a lot of infectious disease physicians who think that broadly. I mean, you're often focused on the human epidemiology or the clinical science, and here's a doctor who's gone and treated patients, but he really does understand too the connections, which was one of the things that was so attractive to me about the whole concept.
Yeah, and the fact that we are the Natural History Museum, and it's our mission to understand the natural world and the place of humans within it. And, to receive this proposal for something that was, the biggest science story at that time, sort of focused around Ebola, but going more broadly to look at other viruses, other pathogens, and diseases. And then to do this with a perspective, that human and animal and environmental health are connected, that there's an ecological context that helps us, understand these threats and also to, decrease our risks of them. With that awareness. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity. At that time, I just started, I told you I started this job in 2014, 4 years ago. So I was a fresh, bright-eyed, right out the gate, curator at this museum, having never done an exhibit. Right? I'd never been working in any curatorial capacity.
This is your first exhibit
at a museum. It is my first exhibit.
Yeah. Good job.
Thank you.
Good thing you picked a simple topic to start with.
No, it was fascinating, but it was my first exhibit, and certainly it's something that is consistent with and relates to what I study and what I'm trained to do, which is understand human and environmental health. That's something that I've been doing, looking at collections of biological anthropology. So mostly we're talking about human remains, and thinking about the past populations, the origin, the development, the processes that go into changes in human environmental health over time. So that certainly fit in with some of that, but I was by no means an expert. A person who had worked so long and done so much as Dan and Jon and others have in this field and with this kind of work. And so it's only with their help, I think, and many others, that we were able to put together everything that people are seeing and really, I think, responding well to with this exhibit now.
So you didn't have any knowledge of viruses before, probably?
I had knowledge of some viruses, but if we think about what I do, looking at bones, I'm mostly going to know about things that I would see in bones.
Of course.
And we're talking about viruses that kill their hosts pretty quickly in some cases. So, and if we're talking about emerging, newly emerging or re-emerging diseases, certainly that's something that we aren't thinking about so much in the past in a way that we could identify the agent that killed a person or might have devastated a population. And also, there's a certain point in history when we don't have the conditions, that are optimal for epidemics. There weren't enough people living closely together and connected in a way that is making this such a serious issue in the 21st century.
Yeah. In fact, you have a wonderful timeline of population growth here. I want to come back to later. It's that way. I don't know if I remember where things are. I'm surrounded. I'm looking at a 80s Egypti up on the ceiling. I can't focus on you guys.
If we think, it's been 4 years, and I've just got the blueprint of this exhibit in my mind, and I think I've got the script, by heart.
Walk us through all the steps to get to this point.
Sure. So the first meeting I remember with Dan, so I met him over the phone. He was calling in, I think, from Liberia. And so there were a large number of us at the museum sitting around a table. And so that was sort of the first step of the exhibits department. I mean, they received the proposal. I was not involved at that stage. But I think once they decided this is something that we might want to green light, and to make that call, is also a matter of, figuring out the space that would be available at the time needed, and, the funds it would take and everything like that, but also who would be involved among our staff. And so there were a lot more people than ended up being on the core team in that first meeting. But I can remember we were all going around sort of saying what we thought about the proposal and, how we thought it might be a good thing for us to do, and what we thought we might need, in terms of people or resources for it. And so I remember, it got to me, and I forget what else I said, but one thing, Dan and I both remember this. I said, why is there not a cultural anthropologist at this table? We have such a great ethnology division here, and those kinds of issues and that kind of knowledge is so important for understanding how disease spreads. And Dan heard me, he's like, whoever said that? He's like, I totally agree. Yeah, anthropologists are so important, particularly in the case of Ebola in West Africa in 2014. So for various reasons, I got the opportunity to take on the job of being the curator of this exhibit in partnership with Dan. Dan was working very closely with our core team, certainly for that first stage. But we quickly put together an advisory board, which included Jon, who would help us, with sort of a regular review of the content. And on a larger scale, we had a number of stakeholder meetings where we brought together a lot of people externally to look at how we were doing and give us feedback about.
So, for example, what would be a stakeholder?
Stakeholder, we're thinking maybe, envision 50 some people in a room in our museum representing, NIH, CDC, State Department, WHO, EcoHealth Alliance, and NGOs, as well as government agencies, philanthropic organizations who were either involved at that point as supporters or just simply, being, in the space of global health and interested in the project.
Right.
And so that would be, sort of a workshop, if you will. Getting from them feedback that could help us continue on with what we were doing.
Now, I understand that initially it was more than viruses. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, we did start out, the first, regular core team meetings kicked off, I would say, early 2015. So more than, 3 years ago. And at that first stage, we had to formalize, we had to decide what our main messages and goals of the exhibit would be. And so part of that was deciding what our stories would be. That's how we do our exhibits in this museum. We tell stories. We have sort of the big story of the gallery, but then also we have smaller sort of vignettes and ways to reach our audiences. And so thinking that those would each feature possibly a disease, we had to decide, what would those pathogens be and why. And as anyone who's been in the hall knows, we ended up focusing on viruses, and particularly zoonotic viruses, because we settled on the main message of One Health. Certainly, Ebola was the catalyst for the exhibit. And then having Dan on board, he'd been, involved in Nipah and MERS and SARS outbreaks and things like that. These are all viruses. So we had that experience and that depth of knowledge already in the team. But as Jon mentioned earlier, viruses, they have this potential, I guess, pandemic potential, if you will, some of them. But for other reasons, they are just, they can be quite particularly concerning when we're talking about epidemic disease. And the zoonotic part of it, the viruses that originate and spread to us from animals, and particularly wildlife, that was that was part of our message that we wanted to bring forth. And so we chose zoonotic viruses that would illustrate that One Health concept.
Okay. Is this the first kind of public health related exhibit that you've done in this museum?
I believe so. Yeah, I won't say at the Smithsonian. We are one of 19 museums at the Smithsonian.
At this particular museum,
yeah.
I have to tell you that over at the National Museum of American History, they had a polio exhibit. A couple of, it was before you got here, I think. I don't know if you remember that, John, but they actually, the reason I mentioned it, because I have a picture of me in it, and it's still online, and you can find it if you search Smithsonian polio virus, and you'll see me as a very young postdoc doing some sequencing, because part of that exhibit was the genome and the vaccine and so forth.
Well, and that was at American History, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they're great. They have a division of medicine and science over there, and I think they opened 64 maybe, and since then I'm sure they've done a number of exhibits around that topic. We actually had some objects loaned to us from them for this exhibit, as you can see in our HIV/AIDS
So I
section.
guess I'm an object in that exhibit, right? Wow.
Yeah.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
So John, we talked a little bit about the idea of pandemic zoonotic viruses. What viruses are in this, and why did we pick them?
Well, as Sabrina mentioned, we wanted to tell stories, and once we also came onto the theme of One Health and the idea that human and animal health are connected around the environment, there are really some I think poignant and telling stories, and probably one of the most significant emerging diseases in human history is HIV. And here's a story of a virus that had been relegated to non-human primates for most of its history, and through the process of hunting and butchering these animals, it made its way into people, and then just fully became a human virus and went pandemic. And this is the kind of thing that illustrates how throughout human history, we've engaged and interacted with animals in different ways. And so we wanted to pick different viruses, different diseases that highlighted different aspects of how people and animals interact. And SARS is a great example of wildlife markets where animals are taken out of their environment and brought together in big concentrations in an urban center, species that often would never interact in the wild normally. And through this sort of perfect storm, we're able to transfer what ended up being a bat coronavirus into other species, including people. But then through travel, through air travel, this quickly spread from southern China to Hong Kong into the world. And so each story, each pathogen we chose allowed us to talk about different aspects of how viruses both emerge and then how they spread once they do. And so some of these diseases like Ebola and Nipah virus. I mean, we've just recently had a Nipah virus outbreak in India. Ebola is going on in the Congo right now. So these things, have been and will continue to be relevant as we go. And the other thing about viruses, I mean, Sabrina mentioned this, but they're so important historically for epidemics because viruses tend to evolve so rapidly and they adapt to many different hosts. So many of the big epidemics and pandemics we've had have been viral. And so they're really, I think, a great basis. You can't talk about everything, but they're an important basis for emerging diseases, coupled with the fact that they're typically in a separate category that don't often have therapeutics. We don't have drugs that are always effective against viruses. Vaccines have to be developed, and that's a constant arms race and a constant challenge. So viruses are particularly concerning because of how quickly they can infect a population.
Yeah.
What I found amazing yesterday was walking through this exhibit, I was listening to people, and this is the first time they get a lot of information about these viruses. What they hear in the newspapers is just the doom part.
Absolutely.
X people die and that's it. They don't get the biology behind it. And this is full of it. I mean, it's just remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, there's something very empowering about knowledge, right? And that's what we do. We present the science in our museum that should, inform people about and sort of our deciders and thought leaders and influencers in society on these issues and why they're so important. But also we made a decision very early on, or at least I came to accept this way of doing it. I mean, my colleagues on the core team who had done exhibits before, obviously that's their expertise, they knew the importance of positivity and hopefulness in the visitor experience, particularly if you want to, I think, be effective with your visitors, having their awareness raised and their curiosity piqued, and also leaving the hall and feeling potentially in a place to do something about particular problems we presented. So for me as a scientist coming into this new way of communicating with the public, I was a bit, I think I was a bit concerned that we would not be doing justice to the seriousness of these issues if we tried to make them seem happy or if we want people to feel good about things that are actually not good at all.
Yeah.
But I really came to respect the ways that you can, I think, utilize your tools and communicate in a way to still bring in that element in a very balanced sort of presentation. And so throughout this hall, in addition to how colorful it is, and how interactive it is, which I think, social behaviors, always or often, sort of a positive experience. But we have literally a motif of on the upside. You see these upward facing arrows throughout the hall. And those are connected to pieces of information, statistics, projects and efforts and initiatives that are addressing the problems that are featured in that particular section.
Yeah. The other thing that the exhibit team, I think you guys hit spot on was, and you're right, the headlines about disease are always how many people died, how much of the population is affected. It's terrifying stuff. But what the exhibit team felt early on was we want to tell human stories.
Yeah.
And that's something you often don't get in headlines either. So there's personal perspectives throughout, not just of scientists or doctors working in epidemics, but survivors of epidemics, people dealing with communication or dealing with the social outcomes of epidemics. Very personal stories. And I think that's important for the public as well.
Yeah, I think, the details, the specifics, you can tell people that, there are those, professionals out there doing this kind of work, but to actually see the picture and have the own words of one of those individuals, I think, is, well, one, you believe it, right? I mean, it's proof. And also, it's something very specific. You can, read about that person, or, in that quotation or that short story, you might learn more that you want to delve into. And I think it's fascinating for people. And the people that we show in those personal perspectives, there are 42 of them, are very diverse in where they're living, what they look like, what they do, and what their skills are. And so we really felt that in doing that, we would provide something for hopefully anyone who's walking through this hall.
I think it's really important to point out, besides the cool mosquitoes, and you have wonderful models of viruses, they're interactive exhibits, but they're pictures of people everywhere.
Yeah.
And what they say, if you want to teach science, tell stories about the people that do it. Right? So that was clearly a goal from the start, to keep people, make it I've seen some of my friends here. And
and I've heard stories from some of our people featured in the exhibit who have come, and so many of us have been sort of lurking, we're just fascinated and excited, to see the public in here finally after this journey, this years-long journey that we took together. And they've been recognized from their personal perspectives. Dennis Carroll just told me this. It happened to him, and I think that's very cool.
I was very surprised to see, there are games here, there are great interactive maps that you can touch and see numbers, but people were reading text as well. That's hard.
Yeah.
To get people to do that, right?
Yeah.
But they were doing it.
Yeah, it really is. There's a real art to that. To make that amount of text enticing. And there are limits to the number of words that we choose to use in a particular place. And this is another thing that, I was always running up against, certainly in the beginning with our writer and the other, exhibit specialists on the team, to be told that I could not use all the words that I wanted to use, or we were going to use different words, and to try to to feel that we were still capturing, the meaning and the importance of the statement. We certainly got there, and I completely appreciate the value in doing that.
Yeah, of course, there's nothing like having objects, right? Like I was at the Zika, which is right in front of us here, huge Aedes aegypti. Below it, there's some insects from your collection.
That's right.
You have mosquitoes, and there's some ticks, and a woman was saying, is that the size of a Lyme tick? I would never see it. And so here, a picture doesn't tell you that, but you see it, and that's the value of having, thousands of ticks in your collection.
Absolutely.
Out, right?
Yeah, so we wanted to show the big mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, 400 times the size of a real one, because we wanted people to appreciate the anatomy, the biology of these animals. And exactly, what they look like, how we differentiate them from a different species, and really what it is about them that can make them so harmful. But then to show the actual specimens, of which we're lucky that we have more or less the largest collection of just about anything in natural history science. And then we've got a 3D model that we've created of Zika virus for people to touch, and it's painted in a way that helps people understand some of the properties.
And people do touch them. I saw for every model, I saw people
love
touching
to touch,
it. So I wonder why. I mean, I have models on my desk, and I love handling them. Right?
Yeah.
But I would think that's because I'm a crazy virologist. But people really,
visual and they're tactile.
The tactile, that is something. There's something so rewarding, I think, about that, and we have to be very clever about those kinds of experiences, because we have so many people, millions of people coming through this hall a year, and you have to build for destruction. So a lot of this stuff is robust, it's protected. We don't have the kind of budget to maintain it or replace it if everything breaks, but certainly, and even with those viruses, we were going to 3D print them, but we could not come up with a material that would be durable enough where we could be certain that we wouldn't be replacing it a lot. So what we did is we 3D printed them, and then we had an artist actually mold them and then paint them so that they would be strong and survive.
It's a funny paradox because viruses are very fragile, yet the models of them can't be. Right?
Most people have no idea what the shape of a virus looks like, or that they're so different. So to give people an opportunity to see them and understand that is great. And I think there's different type of media in here. The multimedia aspects that you mentioned were really important, because it gives people a more personal engagement with the content aside from just reading it.
And those stations were always occupied. There's a gaming station. There's some guess what infection. They were all occupied.
Yeah, and that's so great to see, because Jon he started out on the advisory team and then increased his role, and I will say that most of his work that he did with us in that past 65% was on the multimedia. Right. I mean, it's like designing a whole nother exhibit, and sort of it requires a kind of understanding of gameplay, and timing and engagement that is
Are you a gamer?
So different.
No, I'm actually not a gamer. This is a huge challenge for me to work on this video game.
Well, and to make a game is complex, that would accurately, simulate and carry the messages that we were trying to send was daunting, but I think we did it. So it's
so Ed, since we're talking about people interacting, you're a guide. First, why did you decide you wanted to come to this? Well, obviously you're a virologist, so that was the draw.
Right. Well, it was easy for me to join this, and also the genome exhibit. It was a bit more of a stretch to participate in human origins, but with the explosion of DNA sequence results from us and our ancestors, there's so much to talk about that that fits very well also. So when you're here as a docent, I think you look at an exhibit differently from the way the people who put the exhibit together, okay, where you have been thinking about this long and hard, and you have your own professional experience in setting this up. When you're here it's different for me. I'm here practically on a 4-hour shift, And so you're walking up and down the hallway, trying to engage people in one fashion or another. You quickly realize, no matter what exhibit you're in, that there are many different types of people who walk into an exhibit. This one is no different. There are the people who are simply walking through. They want to get to the cafeteria. They want to know where the restrooms are. More importantly, they want to know where the Hope Diamond is located. Okay, so you can't engage these people. They're on a mission.
Yeah, that was smart.
And then you see the people who are the museum goers. They're reading. They're paying attention. And I know, based on my own experience, that I don't want to bother those people. They know what they're doing. And if they have a question, then they'll come to me because I'm wearing this outfit that defines me as not being a normal person. And so I found from my experience in the genome exhibit, and also down at Human Origins, that if you need to have a hook to get people's attention, other than the people who are going to come up and speak with you. And so the hook I used, both in Human Origins and in the genome exhibit, was a scheme to isolate DNA from epithelial cells taken from your mouth. And that worked great because it was a kit designed and provided by Bio-Rad, and this kit caught people's attention. It got people thinking about DNA and they wanted to talk about DNA. And so I set it up so that when I did the activity, I sort of stopped it halfway through, and then I spent 3 or 4 minutes telling them something. And they were all willing to listen for that long. And the something usually had to do with what's a chromosome and how's it built and how many genes you have. Or let's talk about Neanderthal DNA and how close it is to human DNA, and Denisovans have shown up, and what does this tell us about where we all came from? And so you could get a crowd of 10 or 12 people around a cart doing this, and they paid attention. And so I thought that was very effective. Fortunately, Bio-Rad picked up the tab for this, for the genome exhibit, and reagents have remained so that this activity is still ongoing in Human Origins and in Curious to some extent. I'm not sure that it's appropriate for this exhibit, but something like that I think would be great. And I've been trying to think about the best way to do this. I would like to have something that is first of all, I have to keep on reminding myself that this is not a virology exhibit. It's an exhibit about infectious diseases. But nonetheless, there are these great photographs, and there are these models of what it looks like to see a capsid. But what's inside, and how does it get out, and what does it do? There is nothing in here about a cell, or in reality, or how a virus gets into a cell and how it gets out. Now that's an extension of what this is all about. I understand that. But for the people who are looking for something in addition, I think that that's information that might be worthy to get. So for me, what I do is I have a iPad, and I have slides on Keynote, and I show them a slide or two about how a virus infects a cell, and then talk about this. Cool. What's inside this virus. What I would really like to have is a way to come up with a simple model that they could build, put it on a string, and wear it as a necklace, and walk out of here the same way they do with the genome exhibit. Yeah. And you would end up giving them this physical reminder of what they experienced here, and then they would get this 5-minute discussion.
Yeah, that's not easy.
It's not the same for every docent. Yeah. There's a whole collection of experiences and realities. But I guess based on my background, I would like them to get an opportunity for people who are interested to get something a little bit in addition. This is a great exhibit. It does a great job of providing this message. But when you see some of these people, especially sort of young teenage kids come through, a lot of them are curious, really curious, deeply curious, and you'd like to give them something else. Tell them a little bit about the innate immune response. Just tell them something that they'll go home with, that they're not going to find out someplace else.
It sounds like that's what you could do, right?
That's what I can do. Yeah.
Without having a formal part of the exhibit, you can say, "Hey, I used to be a virologist. Let me tell you about that."
Exactly. Yeah. So what I'm looking for is the right hook to get them to listen, and then provide a little bit more.
So I understand you had to have some training to do this exhibit, is that right?
Yeah, there were a series of classes that were put on, and I took most of the classes. I wasn't able to go to all of them. And it was great for me, to mostly because I was interested in what the organizers were interested in presenting. You know, as you know, we have our own sort of narrow view.
Yeah.
That's been embellished by our life's experiences. But nonetheless, it's not the same as the people who are putting this exhibit together. Sure. And I thought it was important to try to understand that. And again, it was a good review for me for viruses that, you know, I don't know much more about than the average person, other than how many genes it has and how these genes are expressed and how does it get out of the cell, right? You know, that's sort of my level of appreciation.
So as part of the training is to go over each virus and get some background on it?
Yeah, there's a class on, you know, at least an hour on each virus.
Okay.
And I would presume that for the broad cross-section of people who took those classes to be docents, I think it was valuable because it provided an understanding of each of these viruses in a way that they wouldn't easily get. And then there were online training as well, and there were a set of annoying multiple choice questions that you had to answer.
Test at the end.
That's right. And you know, it was one of these classic things of having too much knowledge when you're trying to sort out the answer to a multiple choice question. So,
Yeah.
John, did you make up those questions?
No, actually, I didn't have anything to do with
No,
this.
I think I know because I went through. We had so much support on this exhibit and gifts and donations of all kinds, and so we were fortunate. For example, for the training of the volunteers, we had an opportunity with the Public Health Foundation. They got an online platform for training public health professionals called train.org. And so they, you know, were able to create a module for us for the training of the volunteers for this exhibit. And to, you know, add content and design a training program online that, you know, our volunteers could take that would allow for assessment. But I feel for you, Ed. Like, I went through a lot of these videos. I remember trying to figure out which ones would be best, which sort of, you know, seminars and tests, and I did not do well on all of them. I think it was overthinking sometimes. Yeah. These multiple choice, these reductionist kind of, you know, limiting perspectives on the content. But we're just so fortunate that among our volunteers, we have people like Ed who are so knowledgeable and have so much expertise to bring to the content to enhance it for our visitors and to really give them that experience that, you know, they wouldn't have otherwise, to just increase the engagement, you know, with the material. Sure. And, you know, people continually asked how we would stay nimble. How could we possibly address things in the news if we're designing and printing and, you know, putting up this thing in 2018 and we're open for 3 years? You know, what if something comes up in the news out in the world, the next outbreak, the next potential pandemic? And, you know, the best answer that I would have for that were our volunteers, that we would, during all public hours, have these people on the floor that would be not only trained to discuss the content that we produce, but also have the expertise and knowledge to have those discussions and relate what people are seeing or what they want to know about to things that they're hearing about as well.
So if there were all of a sudden a new flu pandemic, right? Would you get all the guides and say, here's what's going on? You would educate them about that, you think?
I think that's what we can do.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
you know, it's impossible to change the text or the copy in the exhibit itself, but the
I mean, Ed,
human
has
element.
has there been plans or anything? Has that happened yet in terms of
well, Ashley sends
additional
out
training?
articles. Oftentimes, I and other people will send links to articles to her, and then she'll decide which articles she'd like to send out to the collection of docents. And, you know, generally they're well, there's a mix of articles. For instance, there's been you know, new work on Nipah showing up in India, so keeping track of what's going on with the most recent Ebola outbreak, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if there was something like a new flu, then of course that would be top priority. And besides, you do have room I shouldn't be telling you what you can do, but you do have room to take advantage of other sort of visual tools that the museum has, so you can, bring in a video screen and put up a slideshow or a video or something
expert
like
is in
that.
programs, bringing people into the space and also doing other programs elsewhere in the museum that are related to the exhibit. We're doing that already. We've done that on flu, and we did forum activity. We did an HIV/AIDS panel, and in all sorts of ways. We want to be current.
And two of our partners on the exhibit, one way that it is current are ProMed, which is a global listserv that reports on emerging diseases as they're happening in real time, and it's curated and edited, and Health Map, which is joined to that, which visualizes on the globe where these things are happening, and that's constantly changing, and that's something we can update because there's a digital multimedia display about that. But even so, I think the other thing that's nice is that the exhibit talks about, so there's an untold number of viruses out there in nature that we're still learning about, and so it could be that there's something totally new that pops up. But what's interesting is that whatever the virus or whatever the disease we're talking about, there seems to be a more limited number of pathways or mechanisms that these things get out of wildlife or out of nature and into human populations. So even if it's not Ebola, it might be something related to bushmeat hunting. So the exhibit will always tell stories about how these things happen, and if it's just a matter of putting into context of what that new thing might be, I think that there's that evergreen element to this as well.
The particular viruses are, we're not just talking about particular viruses in these different sections, but particular outbreaks, right? Increased infection by this virus in a time or place that's quite specific, but illustrates those concepts, like in our Nipah section, for example, or in the SARS section. And that is something that I think can translate across a lot of different scenarios and cases, situations that people understand.
So the health map is this way, is that right?
So it's
that's gorgeous. I love it.
It's a beautiful piece. It's 2 kiosks, so it can be used by more than one person at a time, and it's just a simplified, but I think for our audience, more accessible and really effective version of what you see on healthmap.org or what you'll read about at promedmail.org. So our partners there, working with us, they put together a map that's like a pinch and pull screen where people can, go anywhere in the world and find out what, the current outbreak might be near that place. They're updating continuously. Our partners over there at ProMed, I think we're going to have probably no more than 50 or 60 outbreaks on that map at a certain time. And they are selecting those that they're curating, our collection, if you will, for those that have particular international significance, I guess I would say, but also with the full knowledge of which viruses we feature here in this exhibit. If there are any new outbreaks of those, they are on that map, so quickly. Just above and beyond what they would need to do for us. I mean, they're just so passionate about the exhibit and this opportunity for people to get that information in this kind of place. And so the Nipah outbreak in southern India, the Ebola outbreak in the DRC, both of which happened around the time that we opened, those were immediately added to what people were seeing on that piece.
Yeah, it's a great. I was there yesterday. And you can sort by virus, bacteria, other, whatever you want. And then if you see a dot in a country, you can tap on it and it will expand and give you some details. Wonderful.
So we wanted to have those filters as well. We do focus on viruses with a lot of the content, but on that piece, you can see other types of pathogens. If people filter, they switch them on or off, they can see how many are viral versus bacterial, for example. Zoonotic versus non-zoonotic, and then also the hosts, humans, domestic animals, or wildlife.
The other interactive exhibit I like is right here, the HIV/AIDS around the world, which is just beautiful. You can tap on a country and see numbers, transmission mechanisms, great teaching aid. And I see a lot of people gravitating to that one.
Yeah.
And it's nice and big too. You can have a
really
lot
big.
of people around.
You can have a lot of
Yeah.
people,
looking
yeah,
at it.
yeah.
We wanted to make that a social piece. And so you can activate all the regions at the same time if you want to, and you move those infographics, those text bubbles around if you want to, if you personally want to compare it to your regions, or maybe you want to, bring over or pull over some information with a neighbor at that piece. And that was hugely challenging to visualize the UNAIDS strategies content for that piece. So what we're doing there is, on the timeline behind that piece, we're showing 4 decades of science and activism in public health care and policy change that were part of the epidemic of HIV/AIDS in this country. But that piece, 1, shows you where we are today, and 2, it shows you how rates of new infection are different around the world.
Right.
And
different
that's
modes
because
of transmission as well.
Modes of transmission, that's because the challenges are different. And so from that piece, you find out what those rates are, whether they're increasing or decreasing since 2010, how close they are to reaching those UNAIDS targets of 90% of people tested, knowing their status, how many of those are, what percentage of those are getting treatment, and what percentage of those are actually virally suppressed.
Right.
Because that is, crucial for ending the pandemic. And to see how each region is doing, but then also you can activate more circles to find out which groups are most affected. So, have the highest percentage of new infection rates. You get an explanation or, sort of some context for what the legal, cultural, social barriers might be to reaching those targets, those 90-90-90 targets. And then you get an on the upside story of a particular group, initiative, project that's trying to overcome those challenges. And it's, I think, been really successful, and it's really fun to, move and I think discover
It's great.
the different layers of content.
I'm curious of how you would develop such a thing, because here in the museum it's a huge object, but you couldn't have started with that. It must have been initially on a small screen, and Jon, you must have seen it at different stages, right?
Oh, yeah, we worked with a really great company that develops multimedia for exhibits, for different museums. And so we initially, everything was scripted. We decided on concept, we decided on content, and we talked about visuals extensively. And their job was really, they're called Cortina, but their job was really to create the aesthetic based on what we wanted and described. So it was an iterative process. It was a lot of discussion.
It was highly iterative. I mean, this piece started out actually as something static. Then we made the decision that we wanted it to be interactive. We wanted it to be digital. And then we went through a long process of trying to figure out what the main message of this piece would be. We knew that we wanted people to see the variation, around the world, that, HIV/AIDS affects people differently given where you are, and that makes the challenges different around the world. But to finally land at a place where we were showing people, I guess in a positive way, putting in the context of getting to treatment for these people is where we really, I think, figured out we were going to be most effective.
So Ed, of all the interactives here, is there any one that attracts people more than others that you've noticed?
Well, I think actually they all do.
They all do,
There seems to be a pretty even spread. I don't really notice a pile up at one spot or another. People come through at their own pace. Some people are, I think most people are attracted to the visuals, the machinery, because I like poking. We've all gotten into that habit. But there's a significant number who will go and read extensive text, actually. It's not easy to go through a museum exhibit. You have to spend time. But there's this class of people who do that. I tend to spend my time hanging around the small section on smallpox eradication. because there's a small
She said
story.
small.
There's a small story there
Yeah.
that's presented, but there's a much larger story that needs
Sure.
to be told.
Right.
And I'm in a position to do that. And so for people who come by, I'm much more willing to accost people who stop to look at the smallpox story and tell them more. And generally, most people are interested. And so I think it's there because it shows that there is an opportunity to address viral outbreaks and to resolve them successful. And so I think that's an important message at the end, rather than to think that we are all doomed to viral outbreaks.
And I think to your point, this exhibit, you can't capture everything, but
Right.
it captures so many different scales. I mean, you mentioned before the fact that a lot of visitors might not even understand what a virus is or how it works, and we certainly didn't focus on kind of that primer level,
Right.
but you can, and people have different knowledge, but there's, how the viruses work, there's the ecology of these systems, the epidemiology, how they spread once they get into human population. So there's different layers of story to tell, from the individual to population to vaccines and what defenses we have against these viruses too. So it's nice, and that's, again, the importance, I think, of having you here and other docents is to bridge.
And
some
each
of those
docent has their
layers.
own perspective.
Absolutely.
They have their own story to embellish.
Yeah, and Ed's absolutely right. I mean, smallpox was included because it was a success story. It's really hopeful, but it's smaller because it's not zoonotic.
Right.
So we didn't
Right.
want to confuse people. And I mean, the reason it could be eradicated, right, is because it doesn't have an animal host, a reservoir in the wild. But we thought that was, a really important disease to include. And also, D.A. Henderson passed away during the development of this exhibit, and Dan, knew him, and we had the opportunity to show a smallpox needle donated by his daughter, his foundation, and so it was a great opportunity for a number of reasons to include.
I think there's also, I saw something, and maybe it was on the One Health summary about monkeypox outbreak.
Yes, yeah, that's also included. That is a
Yeah.
story that does fit into the nuts and bolts of the museum.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story in its own right.
Yeah. I mean, monkeypox, that is included in one of our features, actually in the One Health section. So when you come in, we have this really dynamic piece about human drivers of disease emergence. And so we highlight 4 different types of human activities, industrialization, urbanization, global travel, and animal trade. And then we show them in different parts of the world, because we always want to be able to relate to our visitors wherever they're coming from or whatever their background is. And then we have specific examples of particular viruses, zoonotic viruses, and monkeypox was the one illustrating animal trade, because it's a surprising story that this happened in the Midwest, and the pathway to the human infection was, I think, fascinating for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
Ed, do you think that people understand that population growth and animal-human interactions spread infections? Do they get that, or do you find a lot of questions?
Well, hopefully they get it by the end.
At the end of this,
exhibit.
but before they come in, do they
No,
know?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, my wife isn't a scientist. If I were to talk with her about this in general terms, no, I don't think she has a good grasp of that. I mean, we never really talked very much science in all the years that I was a practitioner.
Yeah.
So I think that she's certainly an interactive, mindful person, but she doesn't think about it in those.
So there's a little exhibit right to our left here of animals in cages.
Yeah.
I guess meat market. That's a live
This is
animal
a
market.
live animal market.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of people looking at that.
yeah.
And this
On
whole
the,
idea.
on the other hand,
Yeah,
I think that the general population has a very good idea about Lyme disease. They have a good idea about rabies, for example. And so, even though they may not actively connect these as being animal to human transmission, they do have that working understanding.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that immediately comes with the public becoming more aware that viruses come from wildlife is moving away from this idea of just vermin. I think people understand that,
Yes.
rats or,
Yes.
ticks or, there's this category of animals that spread disease, and that's in people's mind. But when you start to talk about the fact that almost all these diseases that we're talking about start out as viruses in wild animal populations, the message really, our challenge is to maintain a bit of a conservation and ecology sensibility, that this is not some malicious act of animals spreading disease, but that so many of these things, in fact, most of them happen because of the way that people change the environment around them, that changes the way we interact with these animals. So, so many of these viruses are, happily circulating around in bat populations or rodent populations, and in fact might be perfectly benign when they're in their natural host, and it's only when they get out of that host into a new one, whether it's a cow or a person or a dog, and then we see disease and we see disease outbreaks, and that's really where they get noticed and become a problem. But having that message that this is really an issue of, in a lot of sense, human population and how we're interacting with nature that's triggering all of these outbreaks. So you shift from just simply there's a category of vermin that spread disease to, there's a lot of possibility for sharing viruses and other pathogens with animals, but we have to really focus on what we're doing to make that happen.
Yeah, and the animal market that we've reconstructed there for the SARS section, I mean, that was one issue on which, like, Jon's expertise was crucial. We were actually looking at your photos, we wanted to make it accurate, like the right kinds of animals we would have there, and the right diversity, to actually show that we've got rabbits and chickens and snakes and
civets.
Civets, exactly, and how they are caged together in a way, interacting in a way that they normally wouldn't. They're from different environments and places and habitats, and shedding and sharing viruses.
I had worked on SARS early on in investigation, trying to understand where it came from, and was part of the team that identified bats as the natural reservoir. So really focusing on looking at the live animal markets, where the first reaction was civets were the source of SARS, and then ultimately it turned out they were probably victims of transmission in the marketplace, just like people, and that it came from bats being brought in.
There used to be live chicken markets in the Bronx.
There still are.
Are they still there?
Absolutely.
I thought they got rid of them.
Yeah, New York City. So, and that's the other thing, is live animal markets are by no means, relegated to just China.
Yeah.
They happen all over the world in different ways, and so we need to be aware that.
Ed, what's the most common question that you get here? Is there one that sticks out, or?
Not really, no. Other than the very practical nuts and bolts questions, those are the most common. But there are, exactly.
I get. Anyone sees me in a badge in this building.
That is it.
Oh, that's sad. Well, that train.
But for me, the payback is having conversations with people, especially the interested young kids. I do try to help them understand that the people who do this work are just normal people. And if they have any interest in science, then it's available to them just like it was to us. And they shouldn't think of scientists as being special in a real sense. We're only people who
some less
fell into
normal than
this.
others.
Perhaps,
and we, the secondary message I would say, after One Health for this exhibit is this message of working together, the interdisciplinary, coordinated efforts of people around the world to stop and prevent and prepare for outbreaks and epidemics. And so we've got a whole section devoted to that, showing these personal perspectives again in ways that can relate to the interests of our younger visitors, just saying if you like communication, if you like taking care of people, if you like animals, things that you could do that you might not think about otherwise that are certainly related to the kind of work that we're presenting here, but then also the game, the crown jewel in some ways of for how long it took and how much work and certain probably money to make this thing successful. This 3-player interactive experience of being a team of people who are doing different things on different missions, within a certain specialty or career path. We've got the person in the lab doing, the serology tests, and the genetic sequencing and, building capacity for a field lab, or you've got the animal health person who's sampling animals, on a farm, going into the forest and capturing bats, and then working with, people in a village to better separate wildlife and livestock. Or a human health person who is, either a physician, just coming up with, a clinical description of a new disease, or, doing epidemiology to figure out how that person became infected and spread the disease to others. And then finally, communicating that message through art, and on a mural to, raise awareness and work for public education. And you're doing this all together, and you've got, up on the big screen, someone from the Ministry of Health in this place where an outbreak is in danger of spreading, to a city where it can go anywhere, with harbors and airports, and keeping you aware of your progress and showing you the epidemic curve. There are different outcomes, and you don't always stop the outbreak.
Yeah.
And
did you try it?
I couldn't. No,
you feel so ashamed if you don't. Let me tell you, the practice we got was phenomenal.
I will try it, but yesterday it was packed. As soon as the chair opened up, someone scurried right in, and I didn't want to interfere with that, but it looks really compelling. And I think there are lots of video games that involve disease outbreak scenarios. Not a lot, but there are some out there. They take a long time to develop. So to have a museum have it and say this is cool to do, it's great for kids who then may go and download one on their phone and so forth. I particularly like this exhibit behind us, the Ebola, right?
Yeah.
And this got a lot of attention also because this is in the news, and people looking at it goes, wow, look, that's actually how they do it. It's not very high tech either, right?
Right. No, and we were very careful. With Dan involved particularly, we were able to be very accurate with our representation of an ETU. And the information we provide on these panels, we've got another one of these 3D models. We're talking about the animal health aspect as well, gorillas infected with Ebola as well as people. We're focusing on the 2014 to 16 epidemic here and the role of healthcare workers, as well as the role of the communities in adopting safe burial practices and making these behavior changes.
And the picture is great. All throughout you have these big pictures of real life. Here we have someone getting IV out in the open. It just hammers home how tough it is, right?
Yeah, one of the things that's particularly exciting about Ebola is, as Sabrina mentioned, there was an outbreak in the Congo kind of right after the exhibit opened, but this is the first time in history we've deployed a vaccine to control an Ebola epidemic. And again, talk about a hopeful message. There's, I think, lessons learned is, what the West Africa outbreak exposed was how woefully unprepared the world was for an Ebola epidemic that got out of a rural or remote village and made it to urban centers, which is what happened in West Africa.
Right.
So we had 20,000 cases, half of whom died, and there was just a real slow and inadequate reaction from the global health community internationally, and so it threw us all for a loop. And now with the current outbreak in Congo, even though it was happening in a slightly more remote area, there were certainly urban centers around the current outbreak, and that was on everybody's mind. And so they were, much faster to react. WHO had an emergency fund in place that wasn't before. They jumped on this much quicker. So we can actually see, not so long after, this tragedy, that we're doing better, and history will tell how much better, and that the vaccine that had been around in research development, kind of in limbo for more than a decade, was finally produced and brought to bear on this outbreak and is making a difference. And that's hopeful.
Ed, do you get vaccine-related questions at all?
Sometimes, yeah. And the people, generally it's among older people because we talk about the smallpox vaccine, or people who've been in the military, because they're the only people who get the vaccine now. So they're interested in that. And, people are quick to just show off their scar to their grandkids and stuff like that. So, I think it's an important message about vaccination and a willingness of the population to accept vaccination as something that's important for the population in general, not only their own health. And so there is plenty to talk about. There was some concern about whether there would be anti-vaccinologists who might be argumentative. I haven't seen any of that. And in fact, I think the vast majority of people in this country accept vaccination as an important part of their living and their social responsibilities.
Or at least they don't go to museum exhibits with viruses.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but we don't know, right? I mean, lots of people probably aren't coming here just for Outbreak. We get so many visitors, and the traffic is constant. And so, particularly people coming off of tour buses, maybe not from DC, maybe other parts of the country, who are picking one of the many museums around town to go to. Maybe they are looking for a diamond or dinosaurs or something, but if they walk through this hall, they are going to encounter, in that case, information that maybe they didn't expect.
I think that's important. I mean, that's the value of a museum. You can capture people accidentally and teach them, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're free, and we're also, I guess, a shortcut to the mall. And people pass through for a lot of reasons. It costs you nothing to take a look at what's inside.
I would say anecdotally, my wife tells me that a lot of people come and want to know where the Outbreak exhibit is.
Really?
So,
That's great. Cool.
And so that's a Wednesday afternoon cross section of who comes through. But among those people, there are a lot who are interested in Outbreak. So that's good news.
Yeah, it is.
Well, as I said, I'm going to have my virology classes come here for extra credit. I'd love to take them all on a field trip, but I don't know if we could never schedule that. But so let's talk a little bit about numbers in the future. So this exhibit is on for 3 years.
Right.
And how many people do you expect will see it?
So we get, I think on average, about 7 million visitors a year. And not, I think all the people who enter this building are necessarily going to make it up to the second floor or through this hall. But it's possible, maybe 20 million. And certainly I think it's fair to estimate at least 10.
I mean, that's huge, right?
Yeah.
That is really, and that's why Dan probably originally came to this museum with this idea.
This is
he
the
knew
place
it would
to do it.
Yeah.
a lot of people.
Dan also being local. I mean, I think in particular, if you grew up with this museum or around here, you are aware of how big it is. I mean, we are the biggest natural history museum in the world. We're one of the most visited museums in the world, but also what a center it is for a lot of public activity.
Have you got feedback from the public? Do you have any kind of questionnaires that you?
Yeah, I mean, we have been making plans to do an assessment, and we've done a sort of a pre-assessment survey to get a baseline for what we understood our visitors might know about before we open the exhibit. But that work is ongoing. I'm not on the floor, as often as Ed is, for example.
Well, most people don't express an opinion, but those who do express a positive opinion.
They like it.
Yeah, they do.
And they learn. They say they learned something, maybe.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, what's not to like?
Yeah.
People can go through and spend as much time as they want here. Very few people go from the front door to the back door, I believe, and they pick out what they want. And the likely ones are Ebola, right? For people who are older, they might remember Sin Hombre, and then people stop and look at smallpox. And if they did no more than that, get the general concept, look at a couple of the viruses and walk out, then they've learned something. And I think I should speak for myself. We have to keep in mind that this is one part of a very large museum. And, the people come through with a cross-section, an age grouping of kids who want to go to the butterflies. Some people want to see the Hope Diamond. They want to go see the dinosaurs, of course. And the fact that this place gets filled up on a weekday afternoon, I think is pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And our programs that we've been doing connected to the exhibit, they've been selling out. We don't sell tickets, but they've been beyond capacity.
So what is that?
Far advanced.
What does a program mean?
A program is a free public event. In the evening, in particular, in maybe our Curious Learning Center at the museum, or in our Baird auditorium, we're showing a film. We're having some sort of direct engagement with experts. Most recently, we did a forum activity where the public came together and worked as small groups to simulate a society, a community responding to an Ebola outbreak or preparing for an avian influenza outbreak, and balancing those issues and weighing those concerns, and having a dialogue about what they might want to do. And we had, as we've had in all our programs, amazing experts who are giving their time and in some cases traveling to be part of it. And so we had a virologist present to talk about influenza. We had someone from CDC who came to talk about Ebola, to give people the background before they did their activities. And we've had Anthony Fauci come a couple of times for film and screenings and panels, and so many other experts.
Yeah, and it's probably important to mention too, something else that's really unique and novel about this exhibit is that there's a traveling component of it. While we were developing the main exhibit here, we also developed a portable, freely available part of the exhibit that any institution or anyone around the world can acquire. And basically, these are templates that are customizable, so they can have content, they can have images about the disease in here, but let's say if it was in Thailand or if it was in Japan or China, they could include local stories of people or experiences to make it locally relevant. Yeah, so there's a whole outward facing beyond just what's in the main hall. There's something that's freely available to people all over the world.
So if I wanted to have my virology class do that, I could apply to download this?
Yeah, absolutely. And people have been doing that. The project that Jon's talking about is called Outbreak DIY. And it was a response
horribly wrong, by the way. We may need to rethink that name, because we don't want to inspire people to create outbreaks.
I didn't think about that. But nonetheless, that is what we're calling it, and that is the title for this amazing, extensive set of free digital assets that capture the outbreak content, but also provide tools for customization. In the way that a virus can spread and mutate, this exhibit might do the same thing.
Might go viral.
Go viral, indeed. But this is a new thing for our museum. Outbreak is a new kind of exhibit, and it's not, I think it doesn't capture it fully to say that it's traveling. I mean, we're not traveling with it. We're setting it free. It's traveling on its own, and we are not involved in any way beyond, the initial step of the agreement, just to let us know who's using the content or who has access to it. We don't restrict you or have any requirements for using the full set of panels that we redesigned. There's 16 of them that condense the content here in the hall, and also in some cases have a bit more than we were able to do in terms of addressing bacterial pathogens and AMR, for example. But we have those in monolingual English, and then we have them in a bilingual version. We've got 6 languages translated so far. This is all free. Again, you get the same set, different languages.
Wow.
And then the templates that Jon referred to, those are for people to do their own translations, which we can't vet. And the panels that we haven't pre-designed do not carry the Smithsonian logo. So they will be in that way distinguishable from the ones we provide versus the ones a DIY host made. But we encourage people to do it, as well as with the blank templates, to create their own stories and highlight their own heroes, and discuss and present their own interventions, and in all other ways, provide content that we couldn't possibly know about or deliver to those communities. 1, because we're not there. 2, because we are not part of those communities. And you have the importance of context, in so many situations. In every case, I think, in terms of the cultural and social factors and economic and, geographic, that will be hopefully addressed by this initiative, and we want people to share them back. We
are great.
We envision an opportunity to connect hosts to each other and really facilitate this project and see it grow. We want to see what happens. Again, it's new for us. And, it's so new that we don't have an existing platform to deliver this DIY version of an exhibit. This is the first one, and we hope to build for that in the future. But right now, it's just word of mouth. It's something that is, spreading very organically through our amazing network. And so many enthusiastic people who've been supporting the project are coming to the exhibit. And we've got, I think, at least 50 shows that are going to be going up.
Neat.
In the near future around the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
What about the digital assets? What's going to happen to those when the
They're
exhibit...
part of it. Yeah.
They are.
So we're talking about the digital,
the interactive things.
Yeah. And so those are also part of the DIY. Not all of the pieces, to my knowledge, but by the end of summer, we'll at least have the videos, the big multiplayer game that's going to be available to DIY. I don't know about the HIV/AIDS map. I mean, it'd be wonderful to give everything. And again, it's all for free. And we'd be redesigning programming for easy play on different devices. And we wrote an engagement guide, to give people tips, with the things I've mentioned that we know through doing exhibits work for our audiences. Sure. Thinking about what kind of space you might need, how you want to display things, who you can go to for help, as well as providing assessment tools, promotional tools. And also we give them a link to the same training module on train.org that our volunteers use. So if they want to train an exhibit corps, they can do that as well.
That's great.
So we want to give them as many tools as possible.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up because the museum is going to open soon, and we can't be sitting here in Outbreak with people walking through. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we close up? Do you have a favorite virus?
I guess it would have to be a beneficial one. Would that be like a bacteriophage? Maybe?
Or some other viruses?
Not one that would hurt anyone.
Okay. How about you, Jon?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The one I've spent the most time with, we tend to like our study subjects. So Nipah virus is something that I've been studying for a very long time. But you opened up, Vincent, by saying you're like a kid in a candy store here, and I felt the same thrill with being invited to help develop this, to be honest, because I've been involved in research with Nipah, with SARS, with MERS. And Ebola, and so, but more importantly, like I teach this stuff, and education and public communication is a really big part of what I do, and so this is just a thrilling opportunity to visualize a lot of the stuff we tend to talk about, but that can really be abstract to people otherwise, and so, I'm proud of the whole thing. I'm really excited to have been a part of it.
It's awesome. It's just amazing.
I have to say, just the last thing is, we keep talking about this bloody video game, but that was probably the biggest challenge for me of the whole thing was writing script and developing content for this, because when you're trying to teach technical stuff, it's always about distilling it down to kind of its essential parts. So we wanted to give people an immersive experience about all these different disciplines involved in controlling an outbreak. So what do you use? What do you capture? How do you represent that visually? So it was a big task. It was a big team effort, but that has to have been the
and I don't pity Jon having to explain to his bosses, he has to work on a game.
This was another thing I never imagined I'd be doing.
This is actually very important.
But it was fun. It was fun.
I know your favorite virus, right?
Well, actually, you'd be surprised. I mean, familiarity, I guess, makes one look for something different. So I like negative strand RNA viruses myself. I'm particularly fond of Sinombre virus and the hantaviruses. When I was on study section for years, there weren't that many poxvirus grants, and so Gary Kiefer, who was the exec, gave me RNA viruses to read. And so that was a great education for me. And the negative strand viruses are just, they're just a wonderful delight.
There are a number of them here in this exhibit,
That's right.
All right, that's TWiV. You can find it at Apple Podcasts. You can find it at microbe.tv/TWiV. If you have questions or comments about this or any episode, TWiV@microbe.tv. If you like what we do, consider supporting us financially. You can go to microbe.tv/contribute. We have different ways that you can do that. Our guest today have been from the Smithsonian Institution, Sabrina Sholts. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Jon Epstein from EcoHealth Alliance.
Thank you,
Jon.
Vincent.
And Ed Niles from the University of Buffalo and BARDA. Thanks, Ed. And this is just a fabulous exhibit. And you have to come, listeners, just come to Washington and see it. It's really great. I want to thank the Smithsonian for allowing us to record here. I want to thank Robert Costello for touring me around yesterday. It was just wonderful. At the American Society for Microbiology, Catherine Luntalk and Ashley Peary for their help in getting this going, and our producer, Ray Ortega. And the introductory music on TWiV is by Ronald Jenkins. He's at ronaldjenkins.com. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.